Good evening, dear listeners, and a very warm welcome to you all. Wherever you are tuning in from tonight, maybe cozied up in bed, listening from your favorite quiet corner at home, or perhaps relaxing somewhere peaceful with the world fading away outside. I'm so glad you've joined me here. Take a slow, deep breath. Let your shoulders drop. Maybe pull the covers up a bit higher and feel the day gently slip away. Let the story begin. St. Aldwyn seemed peaceful that summer, where church bells rang softly at evensong and gossip flowed gently over garden fences, where secrets seemed impossible among the good folk who stitched and sipped tea. Then Mrs. Lydia Penrose was found dead at Rose Cottage, slumped across her embroidery frame, a half-finished cross-stitch sampler still in her cold fingers. The doctor called it a simple heart attack, but Miss Marple saw the first small wrongness at once. The silver thimble was missing, though everyone knew she never stitched without it. 5 categories of evidence hide in this story. Chapter 1. The Hunt Begins. The village of St. Aldwyn's lay quiet under the warm July sun of 1958, its honeystone cottages drowsing behind neat hedges of lavender and hollyhock, where the church bells rang softly at evensong and gossip flowed as gently as the stream behind the green, where secrets seemed impossible among the good folk who exchanged pleasantries over garden fences and strong cups of tea. Then Mrs. Lydia Penrose was found dead in the upstairs sitting room of Rose Cottage, her body slumped across the embroidery frame, a half-finished cross-stitch sampler still clutched in her cold fingers. The village doctor called it a heart attack, natural causes for a woman of 62 who had complained of palpitations only the week before. But Miss Marple, visiting from St. Mary Mead for a few weeks with her old friend Dolly Bantry, saw the first small wrongness at once. The silver thimble on Lydia's right hand was missing, though everyone knew she never stitched without it. Miss Marple stood just inside the doorway of the sunlit sitting room, her knitting bag over one arm, needles already clicking softly. The air carried the sweet scent of garden roses drifting through the open casement, mixed with the faint polish of beeswax on the oak furniture and a lingering trace of coal smoke from the morning fire. Underfoot, the worn Axminster carpet felt slightly gritty with dried mud. "How very interesting," she murmured, her blue eyes sharp behind her spectacles. Inspector Craddock, summoned from the nearest town, gave a polite nod. "Tragic, Miss Marple, but straightforward enough." Mrs. Penrose was known to have a weak heart. The maid found her just after 10 this morning. "Did you catch that?" Miss Marple said softly to the invisible listener at her side. The window was locked from the inside. Yet the doctor noted a slight chill on the body, as if she had been exposed to cooler air for some time. "Something doesn't fit here. Can you see it?" She stepped closer, the rough tweed of her sensible skirt brushing the smooth edge of a side table. The room felt warm now from the afternoon sun, but the brass polka by the fireplace was still cold to the touch when she rested a gloved hand near it. On the low table beside the body lay a half-drunk cup of tea, the china smooth and cool with a faint taste of tannin still clinging if one imagined sipping it. A plate held 3 sweet biscuits, one nibbled at the edge. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, its brass pendulum catching the light. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. "One notices these things living in a village," she said. "The sampler shows fresh stitches, bright red wool still threaded through the needle, yet the thimble is gone. Where could it have rolled to, I wonder?" Inspector Craddock frowned. "Probably just misplaced. The maid was in a state." "Perhaps." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Did yours? Watch their hands, their eyes. What do they betray?" "The maid, Young Elsie Briggs hovered near the door, twisting her apron between rough work-reddened fingers. Her eyes darted to the body, and away again a nervous flutter. "I brought her tea at 9:30, same as always, ma'am." She was stitching away, humming to herself. "Said the light was perfect this morning. I went down to the kitchen after that. Baking scones! You could still smell them when the police came." The scent of warm baking lingered faintly beneath the sharper note of floor polish. Outside, gravel crunched under heavy police boots, and distant church bells tolled the quarter hour. A chill wind slipped through a crack in the window frame, brushing Miss Marple's cheek. Next came the nephew, Mr. Gerald Penrose, a tall man in a well-cut suit, his smooth leather shoes creaking on the floorboards. He stood with hands clasped tightly, knuckles pale. "Aunt Lydia was fine yesterday evening. We had sherry together, dry, the way she liked it. She talked about finishing that sampler for the church bazaar." His voice was steady, but his left hand kept flexing, betraying a tension his face tried to hide. "How very interesting," Miss Marple replied, needles clicking again. "And you left at what time, Mr. Penrose?" 9:30, I should think. I walked home across the fields. The night was clear, stars out. File this away. It matters later." Then the neighbor, Mrs. Violet Hargrove, arrived in a flurry of soft wool shawl and lavender water. She smelled of garden flowers and the faint coal smoke from her own hearth. "Poor dear Lydia! We were to meet for bridge this afternoon. She was so looking forward to it." Her eyes, however, flicked once to the embroidery frame with something like calculation rather than grief. Miss Marple tilted her head. "People are really very much alike everywhere, aren't they? One sees the same little patterns repeating. The last to be questioned in that first hour was the vicar's wife, Mrs. Edith Clarkson, a plump woman whose cheeks still held the flush of a brisk walk. She carried the faint taste of strong tea on her breath, and the texture of her knitted cardigan felt soft against Miss Marple's sleeve as they stood together. "I saw Lydia through the window at 9:45, she said. She waved, seemed quite herself. The birds were singing so loudly in the garden. I remember thinking how peaceful it all looked." Sharp listeners noticed 3 things wrong with that statement already, but Miss Marple only smiled gently. "Before I continue, what do you think happened?" As the afternoon light slanted lower, casting long shadows across the patterned carpet, Miss Marple settled into a chintz armchair by the window. The fire had been lit earlier to ward off the morning chill. Now its embers gave a gentle warmth. She picked up her knitting once more, the soft wool sliding through her fingers, needles clicking in a steady rhythm. It reminded her so strongly of old Mrs. Carmichael in St. Mary Mead. "You see, dear, in 1947 old Mrs. Carmichael was found dead in her parlour, with her knitting dropped in her lap. Everyone said it was her heart. She had complained of it often enough. But the vicar's daughter noticed the teacup was still warm, though the maid swore she had cleared the tray an hour earlier, and the French window was bolted from inside. Yet there were footprints in the flower bed outside that matched the boots of Mrs. Carmichael's nephew. He had been pressing her to change her will, you know. The nephew claimed he left at 8, but the postman saw him slipping back near 9:30. The thimble, funny how these small things repeat, was missing there too, later found under the settee with a tiny smear of blood that wasn't the old lady's. In the end, the nephew had given her a little push during an argument. She fell, struck her head on the fender, and he arranged the scene to look natural. He was tried and hanged. Such a sad business, but these village matters so often turn on the smallest details. One must observe carefully. Miss Marple's needles paused. "What does this tell us?" Follow this thread with me, dear listener. The missing thimble, the locked window, the times that don't quite match. Something in this room is wrong. Can you spot it? The evening drew in with the scent of baking bread from the village bakery and the distant lowing of cattle. A cold mist began to rise from the stream. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt, the rough tweed familiar and comforting. "The hunt begins," she said quietly, eyes bright with that gentle steel-edged curiosity. 5 categories of evidence await, physical traces that don't belong. Moments when time fractures, spoken words that twist against each other, behaviors that betray the heart, and hidden connections that bind the guilty to the deed. Stay observant, dear. The game is afoot. Chapter 2. Gathering Evidence. The following morning dawned crisp and cool over St. Aldwyn's, with a light chill wind rustling the hollyhocks along the garden paths. Miss Marple walked briskly toward the vicarage, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel drive. The air carried the fresh scent of dew on garden flowers mixed with the faint coal smoke rising from cottage chimneys. Inside the vicarage parlour, the kettle whistled sharply on the hob, its steam warming the room against the morning cold. She accepted a cup of hot tea, its strong taste comforting on her tongue, while the smooth china warmed her fingers through thin gloves. First she spoke with Elsie Briggs in the sunny kitchen of Rose Cottage. The young maid's hands trembled slightly as she polished a brass candlestick, the cold metal gleaming under her cloth. The room smelled of baking scones fresh from the oven and lavender polish on the wooden table. "I told the inspector everything yesterday," Elsie said, eyes fixed on her work. "Mrs. Penrose was stitching when I brought the tea tray at 9:30. She smiled and said the light was just right for her reds." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked steadily in her lap, the soft wool sliding between her fingers. "How very interesting! And you heard nothing unusual after that? No raised voices? No door closing?" "Nothing, ma'am. I was downstairs kneading dough. The birds were singing so loud in the garden, and the church bells rang 10 just as I put the scones in." Elsie's voice was steady, but her left hand clenched the polishing cloth tighter than necessary. "Watch their hands, their eyes. What do they betray?" The girl's gaze flicked toward the window once, then away. "Did you catch that?" Miss Marple murmured softly. "The timeline just cracked. Did you catch where? File this away. It matters later." Next, Miss Marple called on Mr. Gerald Penrose at his tidy bachelor cottage beyond the green. He received her in the sitting-room, where a small fire crackled warmly against the morning chill. The air held the scent of pipe tobacco and leather from the worn armchair he offered her. Gerald poured dry sherry for himself, though it was early, the glass cool and smooth in his hand. "Aunt Lydia was generous, of course," he said, "but she could be difficult, always changing her mind about the will. Last week she hinted she might leave more to the church instead." His fingers drummed once on the armrest, a quick nervous rhythm. Miss Marple noted the rough tweed of his jacket and the faint smell of coal smoke clinging to it. "You left at 9:30, you said. Yet Mrs. Clarkson claims she saw your aunt waving at 9:45. How do you explain the difference?" Gerald's eyes widened slightly. "Mrs. Clarkson must be mistaken. The light plays tricks at that hour. That statement contradicts something earlier. Remember? What?" Sharp listeners noticed 2 things wrong with that alibi already. Miss Marple smiled gently. "People are really very much alike everywhere. One notices these things, living in a village." In the afternoon she took tea with Mrs. Violet Hargrove in her over-furnished drawing-room. The space felt warm from the afternoon sun streaming through lace curtains, but a chill lingered near the French windows. Violet served sweet biscuits on a plate, their crumbly texture contrasting the smooth china teacups. The room smelled strongly of garden flowers from a fresh bouquet and the faint lavender scent she always wore. Outside, gravel steps sounded as the postman passed, and distant birds called. "We were the closest of friends," Violet said, stirring her tea vigorously. The spoon clinked against the cup. "Lydia told me everything. She worried Gerald was too eager for his inheritance. And that made Elsie, always snooping, I thought." Her eyes narrowed for a moment, betraying a flash of something sharper than sorrow. Miss Marple's needles paused. "How very interesting. Yet I understand you argued with Mrs. Penrose only 3 days ago. Something about a borrowed brooch that was never returned." Violet's hand stilled on the teacup. "A silly misunderstanding. It was resolved." Her voice carried a slight edge, and she avoided Miss Marple's gaze. "Something doesn't fit here. Can you see it? Before I continue, what do you think happened?" The fourth interview took place at the vicarage with Mrs. Edith Clarkson. They sat by the hearth where a small fire crackled, sending out welcome warmth against the cooling afternoon. The air was thick with the scent of baking bread from the kitchen and strong tea steeping in the pot. Edith's cardigan felt soft under Miss Marple's touch as they spoke, the worn leather of the sofa creaking beneath them. "I saw Lydia clearly through the window at 9:45, Edith insisted, her fingers twisting a handkerchief. She waved cheerfully. The clock in the church tower had just struck. The kettle whistled again in the background, and the grandfather clock ticked loudly in the hall. Miss Marple leaned forward. "Yet Elsie says she left the tray at 9:30 and heard nothing after. If Lydia was alive and waving at 9:45, who locked the window from inside later? And why does the mud on the carpet suggest someone entered from the garden after the dew fell?" Edith's cheeks flushed. I may have the time slightly wrong. The birds were so noisy one loses track. Spoken lies emerge when details shift under pressure." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Did yours? Before I continue, what do you think happened?" "The timeline just cracked again. Did you catch where?" As evening approached, Miss Marple returned to Rose Cottage. The light was fading, carrying the chill wind from the fields and the distant sound of church bells. She stood once more in the sitting room, noting the faint smell of polish and the cold metal of the fire irons. The sampler still rested on the frame, its bright threads catching the last rays of sun. Evidence was gathering. Missing thimble, conflicting times, nervous hands, shifting stories, and that locked window that should not have been locked. Hidden connections were beginning to whisper beneath the surface. Who had truly been in this room, and when? Miss Marple settled into the armchair, her knitting needles resuming their steady click. The soft wool felt comforting in the growing coolness of the room. "Evidence gathers," she said quietly to the attentive listener. "But which matters? Stay sharp, dear. The 5 categories are revealing themselves one thread at a time." Chapter 3. The Trail Deeps. The third morning brought a soft drizzle that left the garden paths damp and glistening. Miss Marple arrived at Rose Cottage under a grey sky, the chill wind tugging at her wool scarf. Inside the sitting room, a small fire had been lit against the morning cold, its flames crackling cheerfully and sending out waves of welcome warmth. The air carried the mingled scents of garden flowers from a fresh vase, beeswax polish on the furniture, and a faint trace of coal smoke from the hearth. Underfoot, the carpet felt slightly damp from tracked-in moisture, its rough texture brushing her shoes. Inspector Craddock had agreed to an extended interview with all parties present. They gathered in the sitting room, Elsie Briggs standing nervously by the window, her apron twisted between rough hands. Gerald Penrose seated stiffly in a straight-backed chair, his smooth leather shoes tapping once against the floorboards. Violet Hargrove perched on the settee in her soft wool shawl that smelled of lavender, and Edith Clarkson beside the fire, her plump fingers smoothing her cardigan. The kettle sang from the kitchen, its shrill whistle cutting through the tension, while the mantel clock ticked steadily onward. Miss Marple settled into her usual armchair, knitting needles already clicking rhythmically, the soft wool sliding through her fingers. "Shall we begin again, Inspector? With clearer heads this time." Craddock cleared his throat. "Mrs. Penrose died between 9:30 and 10:15, according to the doctor. The body was found at 10:20. Now each of you claims to have seen or spoken with her during that window." Elsie spoke first, her voice high. "I brought the tea at exactly 9:30. She was stitching happily. I heard the birds singing loudly outside, and the church bells ringing the half-hour as I went downstairs." Gerald leaned forward. "I left at 9:30 precisely. I walked across the fields. The grass was still wet with dew. I arrived home before 10. Violet Hargrove sniffed. "I passed the cottage at 10 minutes to 10 on my way to the post office." Lydia waved from the window. "I distinctly remember the clock striking." Edith Clarkson nodded vigorously. "And I saw her at 9:45 as well. She looked perfectly well. The light was good, and the birds were making such a racket in the rose bushes. The room grew warmer from the fire, yet a cold draught slipped under the door, brushing ankles." Miss Marple's needles paused. "How very interesting. Something in this room is wrong. Can you spot it? Before I continue, what do you think happened?" She rose slowly and moved to the window. The casement was still locked from the inside, the cold metal latch smooth under her gloved fingers. Outside, gravel crunched as a constable paced the path. "Let us examine the physical evidence more carefully." Miss Marple bent and lifted the edge of the Axminster carpet near the French window. There, caught in the weave, lay a small silver thimble, slightly tarnished but unmistakable. "Ah," she said softly, "the missing thimble. It was not misplaced after all. It was kicked under the carpet. See the faint scuff mark on the pile? And notice the tiny thread of red wool caught on its rim, fresh from the sampler." The group leaned in. The thimble felt cold and heavy in Miss Marple's palm, its engraved surface textured with fine scratches. "This tells us someone was in the room after the body fell. Someone who searched hurriedly and dislodged it." Elsie gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Gerald's face paled, fingers gripping the chair arms until the knuckles showed white. Violet's eyes widened with what might have been fear or calculation. Edith clutched her handkerchief tighter. Miss Marple continued calmly. "Now, the hidden connection. These two share a secret. What connects them?" She turned her gaze between Gerald and Violet. "Mr. Penrose, you mentioned your aunt was considering changing her will in favor of the church. Mrs. Hargrove, you were overheard arguing with Mrs. Penrose about a valuable brooch. Yet I learned this morning from the solicitor that a codicil was prepared last month, leaving a significant sum to a certain charitable cause, administered by Mrs. Hargrove. And you, Mr. Penrose, were seen walking with Mrs. Hargrove in the woods 3 evenings ago, though both of you claimed no particular friendship." Gerald shifted uncomfortably. "That's ridiculous. We were merely discussing village matters." Violet's cheeks flushed. "Pure coincidence. People are really very much alike everywhere, Miss Marple. One notices these things, living in a village." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Did yours? It reminds me strongly of a case in St. Mary Mead back in 1951. There was old Mr. Abercrombie, a wealthy widower who lived in the big house by the church. Everyone thought his death was a simple fall down the stairs. He had complained of dizziness often enough. But his housekeeper, Mrs. Green, noticed the carpet runner was rucked up at the top, and a small button from his waistcoat was found caught in the banister. The nephew, Mr. James, swore he left at 8 o'clock for a card game in the next village. Yet the publican remembered serving him a pint at 9:15, and the vicar's wife had been seen taking tea with the nephew more often than seemed proper. It turned out she was to receive a handsome legacy for church improvements if the will stood. The button had been torn off during a struggle when the old man realized what was happening. James had pushed him, hoping to inherit quickly, and the vicar's wife had helped stage the scene because she needed funds for her own debts. They were convicted, James hanged, the lady imprisoned. Such sad affairs, but always the same pattern. Greed, a secret alliance, and one small physical detail that refused to stay hidden. The nephew's muddy boots left prints on the stairs that matched the timing of the dew that night, just as the thimble here tells its own story. One must follow these threads carefully, you see. Miss Marple resumed her seat, needles clicking once more. The fire crackled louder as a log shifted, sending sparks upward. The room smelled now of hot tea that had been brought in, its steam rising warmly, and the sweet biscuits on the tray carried a faint buttery taste when she nibbled one. What does this tell us? Follow this thread with me, dear listener. The thimble under the carpet proves movement after death. The secret meetings between Gerald and Violet suggest a shared interest in the will. The times keep fracturing. 9:30, 9:45, 10 minutes to 10. Yet the window remained locked from inside. Someone is lying, and someone else is connected more deeply than they admit. The trail deepens. Stay sharp. Outside, the drizzle had stopped, leaving a fresh chill in the air and the sound of birds resuming their song among the wet leaves. Gravel crunched again as the inspector's men searched the garden borders. Miss Marple looked at each face in turn, her expression gentle yet unrelenting. The pattern is beginning to emerge, she said quietly, but we must be patient. Evidence has a way of revealing itself when one watches closely. Chapter 4. False Trails. The fourth day dawned with pale sunlight filtering through scattered clouds, casting a gentle warmth over the village green. Miss Marple moved from house to house like a quiet shadow, her knitting bag swinging gently on her arm. The air carried the sweet scent of garden flowers heavy with dew, mixed with the sharp tang of coal smoke from breakfast fires, and the comforting aroma of baking bread drifting from cottage kitchens. Gravel crunched under her sensible shoes as she walked the paths, while distant church bells tolled the hour, and birds sang brightly in the hedgerows. First she visited young Elsie Briggs again, this time in the Rose Cottage kitchen. The room felt warm from the range, the kettle bubbling merrily on the hob. Elsie was kneading dough, her hands dusted with flour, the rough texture of the wooden table cool beneath her wrists. "I've remembered something, Mom," the maid said breathlessly. "Just before I left the tray, I heard a man's voice upstairs, low, angry. It sounded like Mr. Gerald, but he says he left at 9:30. Maybe he came back." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, the soft wool slipping through her fingers. "How very interesting! And did you see anyone else near the garden at that time?" Elsie shook her head, eyes wide. "No, but there were footsteps on the gravel outside the kitchen window. Quick, like someone hurrying away. The sound was clear because the birds had gone quiet for a moment. Something doesn't fit here. Can you see it?" Sharp listeners noticed 3 things wrong with that new detail already. File this away. It matters later." Next, Miss Marple called on the local chemist, Mr. Albert Finch, a red herring she pursued after hearing village gossip. He received her in his small back parlour behind the shop, where the air smelled strongly of carbolic and herbal liniments, overlaid with the faint lavender scent from a bunch of dried flowers. The room was cool and dim, the worn leather of an old chair creaking as she sat. "Mrs. Penrose bought Digitalis tincture from me 2 weeks ago, Mr. Finch said, polishing his spectacles with a soft cloth. "For her heart," she said. "But perhaps someone else got hold of it. I saw Mrs. Hargrove near the dispensary that same day." Miss Marple sipped the hot tea he offered, its strong taste cutting through the medicinal smells. The smooth china cup warmed her cold fingers against the morning chill. "Did you notice anything unusual about the purchase?" "She seemed agitated," Finch replied, his hands fidgeting with a glass bottle, cold metal glinting. "And later I heard she argued with Mrs. Penrose over money. Before I continue, what do you think happened? This trail feels promising, yet something in the chemist's story rings slightly false." The third seat took Miss Marple to the post office, where she spoke with old Mrs. Martha Trimble, another potential lead. The tiny room was warm from a small coal fire crackling in the grate, sending out comforting heat. It smelled of sealing wax, fresh ink, and the sweet biscuits Mrs. Trimble offered from a tin. The postmistress's rough tweed skirt brushed the counter as she leaned forward. "I saw a figure slipping through the back lane behind Rose Cottage around 10 o'clock that morning," she whispered. "Tall, wearing a dark coat like the vicar's. But the vicar was at the church then, or so he claims." The clock on the wall ticked loudly, its pendulum swinging with a steady rhythm. Outside, gravel steps sounded as customers came and went, and a chill wind whistled under the door. Miss Marple noted the woman's eyes darting nervously. "Watch their hands, their eyes. What do they betray?" Mrs. Trimble's fingers twisted a piece of string, betraying unease. "Did you catch that?" The timeline just cracked again. "Did you catch where?" Miss Marple murmured. "That statement contradicts the vicar's wife's earlier account. Remember what?" In the afternoon, she pursued a fourth lead at the local pub, speaking with the landlord, Mr. Thomas Reed, in the snug bar parlour. The room felt warm and smoky, the air thick with the scent of ale and pipe tobacco, mixed with a faint coal smoke from the hearth. A plate of sweet biscuits sat on the table, their crumbly texture dry on the tongue when Miss Marple nibbled one. The fire crackled steadily, its warmth contrasting the cool draught from the open door. "Gerald Penrose was here that morning," Reed said, drawing a pint with a hiss of foam. "Arrived just after 10, looking flushed," said he'd walked across the fields, but his boots were strangely clean for wet grass, and he kept checking his watch. The clock behind the bar was ticking loud, and he glanced at it 3 times. Gerald again, yet his earlier story placed him home before 10. Contradictions multiply. Miss Marple's needles paused, the soft wool resting in her lap. How very interesting. One notices these things living in a village. The fifth rapid scene unfolded in the churchyard with the verger, Mr. Samuel Cobb, who was trimming hedges. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and garden flowers, with a faint undertone of damp earth after the rain. The chill wind rustled the leaves, and distant bells rang the quarter hour. Cobb's hands, rough from work, gripped the shears tightly. "I saw Mrs. Hargrove near the cottage that morning, carrying a small parcel. She looked hurried, and there was mud on her shoes, cold, wet mud that hadn't dried. Violet again, with a parcel no one had mentioned. Something doesn't fit here. Can you see it?" Finally, Miss Marple spoke briefly with the gardener, old Mr. Henry Dawkins, in the Rose Cottage borders. The garden felt cool in the shade, the soil soft and damp underfoot. It smelled of roses and turned earth, with the faint scent of lavender from bordering plants. Birds sang overhead, and the kettle whistled from the kitchen window. "I found a button near the French window," Dawkins grumbled, holding up a small brass disc, cold and smooth, in Miss Marple's palm. "Not from any of Mrs. Penrose's clothes. Looks like it came from a man's jacket. A button, another physical clue, or another false trail. Watch their hands, their eyes. What do they betray when presented with it later?" As the day waned, the light turned golden, carrying the scent of evening baking and the sound of children playing on the green. Miss Marple returned to her temporary rooms, the rough tweed of her skirt brushing the worn leather armchair as she sat. The fire crackled softly, its warmth welcome against the growing evening chill. She picked up her knitting, needles clicking rhythmically, the soft wool comforting in the quiet room. Some trails are false, which lead to truth. The chemist's digitalis, the postmistress's dark-coated figure, the clean boots, the mysterious parcel, the stray button, all tempting, yet each one seemed to pull attention away from the locked window, the missing thimble's true position, and the secret glances between certain parties. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Did yours? Before I continue, what do you think happened?" Sharp listeners will have spotted which details don't belong. The false trails multiplied, but the real threads were still waiting to be pulled. Evidence had scattered like petals in the wind, yet the careful observer knew some would wither, while others led straight to the heart of the matter. Chapter 5. The Pattern Forms. The fifth morning arrived with bright sunshine and a crisp, chill wind that made the hollyhocks sway along the garden walls. Miss Marple requested that all the principal persons gather once more in the sitting-room of Rose Cottage. The fire had been lit early, its flames crackling and sending out a steady warmth that contrasted the cold morning air drifting through the slightly open casement. The room smelled pleasantly of fresh garden flowers in a vase, beeswax polish on the oak tables, and the faint lingering scent of coal smoke from the hearth. On the sideboard stood a tray with hot tea, its strong taste welcome, and a plate of sweet biscuits whose crumbly texture melted on the tongue. Inspector Craddock, looking weary, stood by the mantel. Elsie Briggs hovered near the door, twisting her apron between rough, work-reddened hands. Gerald Penrose sat rigidly in an armchair, his smooth leather shoes planted firmly on the carpet. Violet Hargrove occupied the settee, her soft wool shawl pulled close, carrying the delicate scent of lavender. Edith Clarkson sat by the fire, her plump fingers smoothing the worn texture of her cardigan. Miss Marple settled into her favorite chair, knitting needles already clicking in a steady rhythm, the soft wool sliding comfortably through her fingers. "We have reached a point, I think, where the pattern begins to form. Shall we have one final discussion before matters become clearer?" The major confrontation began quietly, but grew in tension. Craddock spoke first. "The doctor now confirms death occurred around 10 o'clock, give or take 15 minutes. The body showed signs of having been moved slightly after collapse." Elsie burst out, her voice high and trembling. "It wasn't me. I was downstairs the whole time. I heard the church bell strike 10 while I was kneading dough." The sound carried clearly through the open kitchen window. Gerald interrupted sharply. "And I was already home by then. My housekeeper can swear to it." His hands clenched on the arms of the chair, knuckles white against the rough tweed of his jacket. Violet leaned forward, eyes flashing. "This is ridiculous. I passed the cottage at 10 minutes to 10 and saw Lydia waving. She was alive and well. The birds were singing so loudly I could hardly hear myself think." Edith Clarkson nodded vigorously. I saw the same thing. 9:45 exactly. The light was perfect, and she looked perfectly cheerful. Miss Marple's needles paused with a small click. How very interesting. Before I continue, what do you think happened? Did you catch that? The window was locked from the inside, yet several of you claim to have seen Mrs. Penrose alive and waving at times when the room should have been empty, or the occupant already dead. She rose and crossed to the French window, the carpet feeling slightly gritty under her shoes. The cold metal latch was smooth and cool to the touch. Let us look again at the physical evidence. The thimble was found kicked under the carpet near this window. The red thread caught on it matches the sampler exactly. That means someone was searching the room after Mrs. Penrose fell, searching for something small and important. Gerald shifted uncomfortably. His eyes betrayed a flicker of alarm. Watch their hands, their eyes. What do they betray? Miss Marple continued calmly. Now observe this behavioral breakdown. She turned to Violet Hargrove. Mrs. Hargrove, when I mentioned the codicil to the will yesterday, your left hand tightened on your shawl until the knuckles whitened. And Mr. Penrose, your foot has been tapping an irregular rhythm ever since we began. 3 quick taps, a pause, 3 again. Nervousness, perhaps. Violet's cheeks flushed. Nonsense! Pure coincidence. Edith spoke up suddenly. Perhaps the maid did it. She had opportunity, alone in the house with her. Elsie's face crumpled. I didn't. I swear on my life. The room grew warmer from the fire, yet a chill draught from the garden made the curtains stir. The kettle whistled sharply from the kitchen, its shrill sound cutting through the tension, while the mantel clock ticked on relentlessly. Miss Marple moved to the embroidery frame. Here is the crucial evidence found this morning when the sampler was examined more carefully under good light. She lifted a tiny scrap of paper that had been folded and slipped between the layers of fabric. A note in Mrs. Penrose's handwriting. Change will tomorrow. Gerald and Violet must not benefit. The ink is fresh, the paper still slightly crisp. It was written shortly before death. Gerald half rose from his chair. That's impossible, she promised. Violet's hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes darted toward Gerald, then away. A hidden connection stood revealed in that single glance. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. It reminds me of the case of Mrs. Lydia Fortescue in St. Mary Mead in the summer of 1953. She was a keen embroideress, too, always working on altar cloths for the church. One afternoon she was found dead in her sitting room with her needlework in her lap. Everyone said heart failure. She had mentioned palpitations. But the vicar's sister noticed the thimble was missing, and later found it under the settee with a tiny smear of blood that wasn't the old lady's. The nephew and the lady who ran the local charity shop had been meeting secretly. Both stood to gain from the will. The nephew claimed he left at 9, but the postman saw him returning at 10 past. The charity lady swore she saw the victim alive at 10:15, waving from the window. Yet the French window was locked inside, and there were faint footprints in the flower bed. In the end, it turned out the nephew had argued with his aunt about money, pushed her during the quarrel, and she struck her head on the fender. The charity lady helped him arrange the body and wrote a false note to mislead the time of death. They were both convicted. The key was that small scrap of paper with the real intentions, hidden in the embroidery just like this one. People are really very much alike everywhere, you see. Greed and secret alliances always leave the same little traces. Miss Marple resumed her seat, needles clicking once more. The fire crackled as a log settled, sending a shower of sparks upward. The hot tea tasted strong and comforting, the sweet biscuit dry and buttery on the tongue. What does this tell us? Follow this thread with me, dear listener. The note proves Mrs. Penrose intended to cut both Gerald and Violet from the will. The behavioral tells nervous hands, tapping feet, darted glances, show guilt rising to the surface. The physical scrap of paper was the crucial evidence that tied the timeline together. The pattern forms. Do you see it? The room fell silent except for the ticking clock and the soft crackle of the fire. Outside, birds sang in the garden and gravel crunched under a constable's boots. A chill wind whispered through the casement, carrying the scent of damp earth and roses. Miss Marple looked at each face in turn, her expression kind yet unwavering. The hunt had brought them to this moment. The scattered clues were weaving themselves into a clear design at last. Chapter 6. Secrets Unearthed. The 6th day brought a softer light to St. Aldwyn's, with thin clouds drifting across a pale sky and a gentle chill wind stirring the leaves in the cottage gardens. Miss Marple had arranged for the key documents and several additional witnesses to be brought to Rose Cottage in the afternoon. The sitting room felt comfortably warm from the fire that crackled steadily in the grate, its flames casting a rosy glow and sending out waves of welcome heat against the cooler air from the garden. The air carried the mingled scents of fresh garden flowers in the vase, beeswax polish on the furniture, faint coal smoke from the hearth, and the comforting aroma of baking scones that Elsie had prepared in the kitchen. The kettle whistled sharply from the next room, its shrill note cutting through the quiet, while the mantel clock ticked with its familiar steady rhythm. Underfoot, the Axminster carpet felt slightly worn and soft in places, contrasting the cold metal of the fire irons and the smooth china of the tea-things. Miss Marple sat in her usual armchair, knitting needles clicking rhythmically, the soft wool sliding through her fingers with a soothing texture. Inspector Crackdock stood by the window, while the others, Elsie, Gerald, Violet, and Edith, were seated around the room. On the low table lay a small bundle of papers, letters, a draft will, and a faded photograph. "Today we look into the past," Miss Marple said gently. "Secrets have a way of surfacing when one examines old connections." First came the testimony of Mr. Josiah Blake, the family solicitor from the nearby town. He was a thin, precise man whose rough tweed suit smelled faintly of pipe tobacco. He placed a document on the table, the paper crisp under his fingers. "Mrs. Penrose visited me 10 days ago. She wished to alter her will. She was distressed. Her hands trembled as she signed the draft. She spoke of betrayal by those closest to me." Gerald shifted in his chair, his smooth leather shoes creaking on the floorboards. "What betrayal?" "I was devoted to my aunt," the solicitor continued. She mentioned a letter she had received. "Here it is." He unfolded a sheet. The ink was still clear, though the paper had the faint musty smell of old stationery. It reads, "Dearest Lydia, I cannot bear to see you deceived any longer. Gerald and Violet have been meeting in secret for months. They plan to marry once you are gone, and the money is theirs. I saw them together last week by the old mill. The letter is signed by a Mrs. Clara Dutton, an old-school friend of Mrs. Penrose who lives in the next county." Violet Hargrove's face drained of color. Her hands clutched the soft wool of her shawl so tightly that the fabric bunched. "That's a lie! I barely know Mr. Penrose." Miss Marple's needles paused. "How very interesting. The hidden connection is becoming clearer. These two share a secret. What connects them? The letter mentions meetings by the old mill. Several villagers have now confirmed seeing a man and woman matching your descriptions there on 3 separate evenings." Gerald's voice rose. "This is outrageous. We were discussing business matters. Business? Miss Marple asked mildly. Or the business of hastening an inheritance? Next, Elsie Briggs was asked to fetch a small locked box from Mrs. Penrose's bedroom. When opened, it revealed a bundle of letters tied with ribbon. The paper felt slightly brittle, carrying a faint scent of lavender sachet. One letter, dated 2 months earlier, was from Violet to Gerald. "My dearest G," it began, "Lydia suspects nothing. Once the new will is prevented and the money secured, we can be together openly. Be patient. The digitalis is safely hidden. The handwriting was elegant, the ink still dark. The room grew warmer from the fire, yet a chill draught from the garden window made the curtains stir gently. Outside, gravel crunched under the feet of a passing constable, and birds called cheerfully in the rose bushes. The taste of strong tea lingered on Miss Marple's tongue as she sipped from her cup, the smooth china warm in her hands. Gerald sprang to his feet. "That letter is forged! Someone planted it." Violet remained silent, her eyes fixed on the carpet, but her fingers betrayed her, twisting and untwisting the edge of her shawl in rapid, nervous movements. Miss Marple continued calmly. "Now the motive becomes clear. Mrs. Penrose had discovered the affair and the plan to marry after her death. She intended to disinherit both of them. That provided a very strong reason to act quickly, before the new will could be signed and witnessed." Edith Clarkson spoke up, her voice shaky. "I knew nothing of this. I only saw Lydia waving that morning." "Did you?" Miss Marple asked. "Or did you see what you were meant to see? The timeline has many fractures, but the letters fill the gaps. The digitalis mentioned was never for Mrs. Penrose's heart. It was purchased by Violet under a false name at the chemist in the next village. Mr. Finch confirmed it this morning when shown the photograph of Violet." Violet's head jerked up. "You have no proof." "The proof is in the pattern," Miss Marple replied. "The secret meetings, the letters, the planned marriage, the fear of disinheritance, all unearthed today." She turned to the group, her knitting resting in her lap. The fire crackled as a log shifted, sending a small shower of sparks upward. The scent of baking scones drifted stronger from the kitchen, warm and buttery, mixing with the faint coal smoke still clinging to the chimney. "It reminds me of the sad case of the Mrs. Pendleton in St. Mary Mead in 1949, Miss Marple said. "2 elderly sisters lived together in Ivy Cottage. Everyone thought they were devoted. Then one sister, Miss Harriet, was found dead in her bed with a bottle of sleeping draught beside her. The surviving sister, Miss Dora, said it was suicide. Harriet had been depressed. But the doctor noticed the glass had been wiped clean, though Harriet always left fingerprints everywhere. A hidden letter was later found in a sewing box. Harriet had discovered that Dora had been secretly corresponding with a gentleman who promised marriage once Dora inherited the house and money. The sisters had argued violently the night before. Dora had given her sister an extra dose of the draught and arranged the scene. The gentleman was in on the plan. They had been meeting at the churchyard in secret for months. The key was the letters and the wiped glass. Dora was tried and sentenced to life imprisonment. The gentleman fled, but was caught later. Such affairs always turn on the same human weaknesses: greed, secret romance, and the belief that small deceptions will stay hidden. People are really very much alike everywhere, you see. One notices these things when one has lived long in a village." Miss Marple's needles resumed their soft clicking. The hot tea tasted strong and reassuring. The sweet biscuit she nibbled was dry and crumbly. "Secret surface," she said quietly. "Truth approaches. The hidden connections between Gerald and Violet have been laid bare. The affair, the planned marriage, the fear of losing the inheritance. the motive is now clear as day. The past has spoken through these letters and testimonies. Outside, the chill wind rustled the leaves, carrying the distant sound of church bells and the crunch of gravel underfoot. The fire continued its gentle crackle, warming the room against the cooling afternoon. Miss Marple looked at each strained face in turn, her expression gentle yet resolute. The pieces were falling into place. The hunt had uncovered what had long been concealed. Chapter 7. The Revelation. The evening of the 6th day had deepened into a quiet night when Miss Marple requested that everyone concerned gather once more in the sitting-room of Rose Cottage. A fire burned brightly in the grate, crackling and throwing out a steady warmth that held back the chill wind whispering at the windows. The air was thick with the scent of garden flowers from a fresh vase, beeswax polish on the oak surfaces, faint coal smoke from the hearth, and the comforting aroma of strong tea that had just been poured. The mantel clock ticked steadily, its brass pendulum catching the firelight, while outside gravel crunched softly under the feet of the waiting constable and distant church bells tolled the hour. The carpet felt soft and slightly worn beneath their shoes, the smooth china teacups warm in cold hands, and the rough tweed and soft wool of jackets and shawls rustled as people shifted uneasily. All the suspects were present. Elsie Briggs standing anxiously by the door, twisting her apron. Gerald Penrose seated stiffly, his hands clenched on the arms of his chair. Violet Hargrove on the settee, her lavender-scented shawl pulled tight. Edith Clarkson beside the fire, her plump fingers smoothing her cardigan. And Inspector Craddock standing near Miss Marple with a notebook ready. Miss Marple sat in her armchair, knitting needles, clicking rhythmically. At first, the soft wool sliding through her fingers. Then the needles paused as she looked around the room with gentle but piercing blue eyes. "The time has come," she said calmly. "I shall review each category of evidence in turn. Listen carefully, dear friends and dear listener." She began with the first category. Physical evidence, objects that don't fit. Something in this room was wrong from the very beginning. The silver thimble, which Mrs. Penrose never stitched without, was found kicked under the carpet near the French window. A tiny red thread from the sampler was caught on its rim. That proves someone searched the room hurriedly after the body fell. The window remained locked from the inside, yet faint scuff marks on the carpet and a small button found in the garden border suggest movement and a brief exit or entry. The sampler itself hid a crucial note written shortly before death. These objects told us the scene had been disturbed after death. Did you catch that? The window was locked inside. Miss Marple's voice remained soft. Next, timeline fractures. When time doesn't add up, the timeline just cracked repeatedly. Elsie claimed she left the tray at 9:30 and heard the bells strike 10 while kneading dough downstairs. Gerald said he left at 9:30 and was home before 10. Violet and Edith both insisted they saw Mrs. Penrose waving at 9:45 or 10 minutes to 10. Yet the doctor fixed death at approximately 10 o'clock. These statements cannot all be true. The fractures showed that at least 2 people were lying about the exact sequence of events. She continued steadily. Spoken lies, contradictions, and slips. That statement contradicts something earlier. Remember what? Gerald first said. He walked across the fields, yet his boots were strangely clean. Violet claimed close friendship with Lydia, but was caught in a lie about the brooch argument. Edith adjusted her citing time when pressed. Elsie added a new detail about a man's angry voice only later. Each spoken lie chipped away at their stories until the truth began to emerge. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Behavioral tells? actions revealing truth. Watch their hands, their eyes. What do they betray? Gerald's foot tapped an irregular rhythm when the will was mentioned. Violet's hands tightened on her shawl until the knuckles whitened. Elsie's gaze darted to the window whenever the time was discussed. Edith twisted her handkerchief repeatedly. These small betrayals of nervousness and guilt rose to the surface when pressure increased. Finally, she addressed the last category. Hidden connections. The secret relationships. These two share a secret. What connects them? The letters unearthed yesterday revealed everything. Gerald and Violet had been conducting a secret affair for months, meeting by the old mill. They planned to marry once Mrs. Penrose was gone, and the inheritance secured. The letter from Clara Dutton and Violet's own note mentioning the digitalis and preventing the new will made the motive crystal clear. Greed and forbidden romance bound them together. Miss Marple set her knitting aside completely now. The fire crackled louder as a log settled, sending sparks dancing upward. The room felt warm and close, yet a faint chill draft from the garden window brushed against ankles. The strong tea tasted bitter on the tongue now, the sweet biscuits untouched on the plate. All 5 categories point to the same conclusion. The murderer is Gerald Penrose, aided by Violet Hargrove. Gerald shot to his feet. This is monstrous. You have no proof. Miss Marple regarded him calmly. The proof lies in the pattern, Mr. Penrose. You returned quietly after 9:30, entering through the garden. You argued with your aunt about the will. In the heat of the moment, you pushed her. She fell, striking her head on the fender. Panicking, you searched for the new will or any incriminating papers. That is when the thimble was dislodged and kicked under the carpet. You then slipped out through the French window, locking it from the outside with a thin wire or similar trick, a common enough village device, and re-entered the house briefly to create the appearance of normalcy. Violet helped by providing false sightings of your aunt alive at 9:45, hoping to confuse the time of death. The digitalis was a red herring, never used. The real cause was the fall and the blow to the head, staged to look like a heart attack. Violet began to sob quietly, her hands shaking. We didn't mean for her to die. Inspector Craddock stepped forward. Gerald Penrose, Violet Hargrove, I am placing you both under arrest for the murder of Lydia Penrose. The room erupted briefly with exclamations and protests, but the evidence held firm. Elsie looked relieved, her hands finally still. Edith Clarkson sat pale and silent, cleared of any real suspicion. The fire continued its gentle crackle. The clock ticked on, and the scent of tea and flowers lingered in the air. Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more, the needles resuming their soft, steady click. The hunt ends, she said quietly, her eyes kind yet satisfied. Truth revealed. One notices these things, living in a village. People are really very much alike everywhere. Outside, the night wind carried the distant sound of an owl and the faint crunch of gravel as the prisoners were led away. The sitting room felt suddenly calmer, the warmth of the fire wrapping around those who remained. Chapter 8. Justice begins. The morning after the revelation dawned gray and still, with a light chill wind carrying the scent of damp garden flowers and distant coal smoke from cottage chimneys. Rose Cottage felt quieter now, the sitting room warm from a freshly lit fire whose flames crackled softly and sent out comforting waves of heat. The air held the mingled aromas of beeswax, polish on the furniture, faint lavender from Violet's abandoned shawl still draped over a chair, and the strong tea that Miss Marple sipped from a smooth china cup. Outside, gravel crunched under heavy police boots as Inspector Craddock supervised the formal arrest. The mantel clock ticked steadily. Its sound clear in the hush, while distant church bells tolled the hour with a solemn note. Gerald Penrose stood pale and rigid by the doorway, his rough tweed jacket feeling rough against his skin as handcuffs clicked coldly around his wrists. Violet Hargrove sat on the settee, her soft wool shawl clutched tightly, tears tracing silent paths down her cheeks. The cold metal of the cuffs felt harsh against her skin when her turn came. Elsie Briggs hovered near the kitchen door, her hands finally still, the rough texture of her apron forgotten. Edith Clarkson watched from beside the fire, her plump face flushed with shock, the warm firelight playing across her cardigan. Inspector Craddock spoke formally. "Gerald Penrose and Violet Hargrove, you are under arrest for the murder of Lydia Penrose. You will be taken to the station and charged." Gerald's voice cracked as he was led toward the door. "This is a mistake. My aunt had a weak heart. It was natural causes." Miss Marple sat calmly in her armchair, knitting needles clicking with their familiar rhythm, the soft wool sliding through her fingers. "How very interesting that you still cling to that story, Mr. Penrose. But justice must begin its work." The arrest scene unfolded with quiet efficiency. 2 constables escorted Gerald out first. His smooth leather shoes scraped on the gravel path, the sound sharp in the morning air. A chill wind tugged at his coat as he was helped into the police car. Violet followed, her steps hesitant, the soft wool of her shawl catching on the doorframe. She glanced back once at the sitting room, her eyes wide with disbelief. The car doors slammed with a heavy finality, and the engine started with a low rumble that faded as they drove away down the lane. Birds sang tentatively in the garden as if unsure whether normal life could resume. Inside, the remaining group sat in stunned silence for a moment. The fire crackled louder as a log shifted, sending a shower of sparks upward. The room smelled now of the hot tea that Elsie poured with trembling hands, its strong taste cutting through the tension, and the sweet biscuits that no one touched. The carpet felt soft underfoot, contrasting the cold metal poker that stood untouched by the hearth. Miss Marple set her knitting aside briefly. "Character reactions can be most revealing," she observed gently. "Elsie, my dear, you look quite relieved." Elsie nodded, her rough hand smoothing her apron. "I was so frightened, Mom. They kept looking at me as if I might have done it. But I was only baking scones downstairs. The scent of them still lingers, doesn't it? I never touched her." Edith Clarkson leaned forward, her voice shaky. "I feel such a fool. I really did think I saw Lydia waving at 10:15. The light was good, the birds were singing loudly, and everything seemed so peaceful. How could I have been so mistaken?" Miss Marple smiled kindly. "You were not mistaken in what you saw, Mrs. Clarkson. You were misled in when you saw it." Violet positioned herself carefully to create that false sighting, hoping to stretch the timeline. A common enough trick in village matters. The conversation turned to explaining the red herrings that had muddied the waters. Inspector Craddock, who had returned after seeing the prisoners off, accepted a cup of hot tea, its smooth china warm against the morning chill. The chemist's story about digitalis was a false trail. Violet did purchase it, but under a false name, intending it as a backup plan that was never needed. The real cause was the fall and the blow to the head during the argument with Gerald. Miss Marple nodded. The postmistress's dark-coated figure was another distraction, simply the vicar on his early rounds, nothing to do with the crime. The button found in the garden belonged to Gerald's spare jacket. He lost it while searching the flower bed in panic, after locking the window from outside with a thin piece of wire he had prepared in advance. The clean boots were explained by the fact that he changed them quickly at home before going to the pub, creating the appearance of an innocent walk. Craddock continued. "The mysterious parcel, Mrs. Hargrove carried was only some lace she was returning, nothing sinister. And the angry man's voice Elsie heard? That was Gerald arguing with his aunt moments before the fatal push." Edith sighed with relief. "So I am not implicated at all." "Not at all," Miss Marple reassured her. "Your only fault was trusting what you thought you saw. False trails often rely on honest witnesses like yourself." False suspects were cleared one by one. Elsie's nervousness had stemmed purely from fear of being accused, not guilt. Her timeline of baking and hearing the bells proved solid once the false sightings were removed. Edith Clarkson was thanked for her honesty and sent home with a gentle pat on the arm, her soft cardigan brushing Miss Marple's sleeve. The village gossip about the chemist and the verger faded as the real story emerged. The room grew warmer as the fire burned brighter, the scent of baking scones drifting stronger from the kitchen where Elsie had resumed her duties with lighter steps. Outside, the chill wind had dropped, and the sound of children playing on the green returned faintly, along with the crunch of gravel under normal village feet. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, the needles resuming their steady click. The soft wool felt comforting in her hands against the morning's events. "Justice begins its work," she said quietly. "The innocent can breathe freely once more. The guilty have been taken away, and the village can begin to heal from the shock." Inspector Craddock nodded. "Your help has been invaluable, Miss Marple. Without your sharp eyes on the physical evidence, the timeline fractures, the spoken contradictions, the behavioral tells, and those hidden connections, we might still be chasing shadows." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled gently. "One notices these things, living in a village. People are really very much alike everywhere." The morning light strengthened, casting a warmer glow through the windows. The fire continued its gentle crackle. The tea tasted strong and reassuring, and a sense of order slowly returned to Rose Cottage. Justice had begun its measured work, slow but certain, as it always did in such matters. Chapter 9. After the hunt. The days following the arrests settled over St. Aldwyn's with a gentle quiet, the summer sun warming the honey-stone cottages and drying the last traces of morning dew on the garden paths. Rose Cottage stood with its windows open to the fresh air. The sitting-room now filled with the cheerful scent of garden flowers arranged in a new vase, the faint sweetness of baking bread drifting from the kitchen, and the comforting aroma of strong tea steeping in the pot. A small fire still crackled in the grate against the occasional chill wind that slipped through the casement, its flames casting a warm glow over the polished oak furniture. The mantel clock ticked steadily, its rhythm soothing, while outside gravel crunched under the postman's boots, and distant church bells rang the hour with a lighter tone. Miss Marple sat once more in her favorite armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly, the soft wool sliding through her fingers with familiar comfort. The rough tweed of her skirt brushed the worn leather of the chair arms as she worked. Inspector Craddock had returned briefly that morning to share the latest developments, his smooth leather notebook resting on the table beside a plate of sweet biscuits, whose crumbly texture melted pleasantly on the tongue when nibbled with hot tea. "The magistrate's hearing went smoothly yesterday," Craddock said, accepting a cup of tea, its smooth china warm against the morning chill that lingered near the windows. "Both Gerald Penrose and Violet Hargrove have been formally charged with murder." Gerald has admitted the argument and the fatal push, though he still claims it was an accident. Violet has confessed to helping stage the scene and providing the false sightings to confuse the timeline. Miss Marple nodded, her needles pausing for a moment. How very interesting. The legal resolution has begun, then. One always hopes for justice tempered with mercy where possible. But the facts were quite clear. Elsie Briggs entered with a fresh pot of tea, her steps lighter now, the rough texture of her work apron no longer twisted in anxiety. She smiled shyly as she poured. The house feels different already, Mom. No more shadows in the corners. I've started cleaning the upstairs thoroughly. The scent of lavender polish is everywhere now, and the carpet feels fresh underfoot again. Edith Clarkson arrived shortly after, carrying a small basket of flowers from her own garden. The soft wool of her cardigan felt warm as she embraced Miss Marple briefly. I've been thinking about poor Lydia every night, she said, her voice steadier than before. But the village is beginning to talk of other things. The church bazaar is going ahead, and people are being kind. Transformations are happening, aren't they? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Indeed they are, my dear. The village that turned suspicious and watchful is slowly healing. One notices these things living in a village. People are really very much alike everywhere, quick to fear, but also quick to forgive once the truth is known. The transformations showed clearly in the days that followed. Gerald Penrose, once the confident nephew who walked the fields with easy assurance, now sat in a cold cell, his hidden greed and secret romance exposed for all to see. From suspected beneficiary to revealed murderer, his future had narrowed to the slow processes of the law. Violet Hargrove, who had moved through the village with elegant composure and lavender scent, now faced the same stark reality. Her planned marriage and comfortable inheritance had vanished, replaced by the weight of complicity in a death. The innocent suspect, young Elsie, had moved from nervous fear of accusation to open relief, her baking filling the cottage once more with warm, buttery scents, and her hands steady on the dough. The village itself had shifted. In the first days after the discovery, suspicion had hung heavy like coal smoke in the air, whispers at the post office, side glances in the churchyard, locked doors that were usually left open. Now, as the truth spread, conversations resumed over garden fences. The postmistress shared the latest news with a sigh of relief. The verger trimmed hedges with lighter strokes, and children played on the green without the earlier hush. Healing began in small acts. Flowers left at Lydia's grave, offers of help with the cottage garden, and shared cups of tea where gossip turned from accusation to quiet remembrance. Miss Marple walked through the village that afternoon, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel paths. The chill wind had softened, carrying the scent of roses and freshly turned earth from the borders. She stopped at the vicarage, where Edith served hot tea tasting strong and sweet with biscuits. The fire crackled in the parlour, its warmth welcome against the cooler air near the windows. Futures are indicating themselves already, Edith said. The solicitor tells me Lydia left a generous bequest to the church after all. The new will was never signed, but her intentions were clear in the hidden note. The bazaar will have extra funds, and perhaps a memorial sampler in her memory. Miss Marple smiled gently. That seems most fitting, and young Elsie will stay on to care for the cottage until matters are settled. She has grown in confidence these past days. Watching her hands move steadily now instead of trembling is a pleasure to see. As evening approached, the light turned golden, warming the stone walls and casting long shadows across the green. Miss Marple returned to Rose Cottage, the rough tweed of her skirt brushing the garden gate. Inside, the sitting room smelled of evening baking and the faint coal smoke from the fire that had been lit against the cooling air. The smooth china teacups stood ready, and the soft wool of her knitting waited in the basket. The village was healing. Life continued in its quiet rhythm, church bells ringing, birds singing in the hedgerows, kettles whistling in kitchens, and neighbors exchanging pleasantries once more. The murderer had been transformed from hidden deceiver to exposed culprit and now faced judgment. The innocent had been cleared and relieved of their burdens. Miss Marple herself had moved from quiet observer to active hunter, and finally to revealer of truth, her gentle persistence bringing clarity where confusion had reigned. She settled into her armchair, needles resuming their steady click. The hot tea tasted comforting, the sweet biscuit dry and buttery. Outside, the chill wind whispered through the leaves, but inside all was warmth and order restored. "The village heals," Miss Marple said softly to the empty room, though she knew the attentive listener understood. "Life continues. Small threads of kindness are already mending what was torn. One notices these things, living in a village." The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in soft hues, and the sound of distant laughter drifted on the evening air. After the hunt, peace was returning to St. Aldwyn's, thread by careful thread. Chapter 10. By the fire, Miss Marple sat by the fire in her own comfortable sitting-room back in St. Mary Mead, the soft glow of the flames casting a warm light across the familiar chintz curtains and polished furniture. The evening had grown cool with a gentle chill wind rustling the leaves outside the window, but inside the room felt snug and inviting. The air carried the comforting scent of garden flowers from a vase on the side table, the faint trace of coal smoke from the hearth, and the rich aroma of strong tea steeping in the pot. Her knitting needles clicked steadily in her lap, the soft wool sliding smoothly through her fingers, its texture a familiar comfort after the busy weeks in St. Aldwyn's. A plate of sweet biscuits rested nearby, their crumbly dryness pleasant with the hot tea whose warmth spread through the smooth china cup she held. The news from the village had arrived that afternoon in a letter from Dolly Bantry, full of village gossip and resolutions. Miss Marple read it again by the firelight, the paper rustling softly. Gerald Penrose and Violet Hargrove remained in custody, their trial set for the autumn assizes. Elsie Briggs had decided to stay on at Rose Cottage as caretaker, her confidence growing with each passing day. The church bazaar had been a great success, with Lydia Penrose's unfinished sampler displayed as a memorial, its bright red threads catching many eyes. Edith Clarkson had taken to visiting the cottage regularly, bringing flowers and helping with the garden. The village had settled back into its peaceful rhythm, the earlier suspicions fading like morning mist. Miss Marple set the letter aside and picked up her knitting once more, the needles resuming their rhythmic click. The fire crackled gently, sending occasional sparks upward, while the grandfather clock in the hall ticked with its steady, reassuring sound. Outside, distant church bells rang the hour, and a few birds still sang in the twilight. The room felt warm against the cooling evening air, the rough tweed of her skirt brushing the worn leather of the armchair. She reflected deeply on the case, her blue eyes thoughtful behind her spectacles. Each of the 5 categories revealed something essential, she murmured to the empty room, though she knew the dear listener was still with her in spirit. The physical evidence, the missing thimble kicked under the carpet with its red thread, the button in the garden border, the note hidden in the sampler, showed that the scene had been disturbed after death. Those small objects that didn't belong told the story of a hurried search and a staged exit. The timeline fractures exposed the lies. The conflicting times of 9:30, 9:45, and 10 minutes to 10 could not all be true, revealing who was where and when. The spoken lies. Gerald's claim of clean boots after a wet field walk, Violet's shifting stories about the brooch, the added details that changed under pressure, crumbled when examined closely. The behavioral tells were most telling in their quiet way. Nervous hands clutching shawls, tapping feet, darted glances, all betraying guilt when the truth drew near. And the hidden connections. The secret affair between Gerald and Violet, their meetings by the old mill, the letters planning marriage after the inheritance, provided the clear motive that tied everything together. Without any one category, the pattern would have remained hidden. Together, they formed a complete picture. Her needles paused for a moment as she stared into the flames. It reminds me so much of the case of old Mr. Lucius Harrow in St. Mary Mead back in 1952. He was a keen gardener, always working on his prize roses. One evening he was found dead in his potting shed, a trowel still in his hand. Everyone said it was a heart attack. He had complained of chest pains for months, but the vicar's daughter noticed the trowel was clean, though the soil on his boots was fresh and damp. The greenhouse window was latched from inside, yet there were faint footprints outside in the flower bed that matched the nephew's shoes. The nephew swore he left at 8 o'clock for a whist drive, but the postman saw him slipping back near 9:30, and there was a hidden letter in the seed catalogue. Mr. Harrow had planned to change his will, cutting out the nephew who had been secretly romancing the widowed housekeeper. The nephew had argued with his uncle, pushed him during the quarrel, and arranged the scene to look natural. The housekeeper helped by providing a false alibi, claiming she saw the old man alive at 9:45. They were both convicted in the end. The key was that small, clean trowel and the hidden letter, much like the thimble and the note in the sampler here. The timeline didn't add up, the spoken excuses contradicted each other, the nervous behavior gave them away, and the secret romance provided the motive. People are really very much alike everywhere, you see. Greed, secret alliances, and the belief that one can rearrange small details to hide the truth always leave the same traces. One must simply observe carefully and let the categories guide the way. Living in a village teaches one to notice these patterns repeating across the years. The human heart doesn't change much, no matter the time or place. Miss Marple resumed knitting, the soft click of the needles blending with the fire's crackle and the clock's ticking. The hot tea tasted strong and reassuring, the sweet biscuit providing a pleasant contrast on the tongue. The room felt cocooned in warmth against the chill night air outside, where a light wind whispered through the garden and distant owls called softly. "Why does observation matter so much?" she continued thoughtfully. "Because people reveal themselves in the smallest things. The way a hand tightens, the way a story shifts by 5 minutes, the object that is out of place. Villages are like microcosms of the world. The same motives, love, money, fear, play out in cottage parlours as in grand houses. One learns to watch not just for the dramatic, but for the ordinary detail that doesn't quite fit. That is how truth emerges, thread by thread, like a well-worked sampler. In the end, it is not cleverness, but patient watching that solves these matters. Human nature is consistent, dear listener. We all want security, affection, and sometimes more than our share. When those desires twist into deceit, the 5 categories will almost always expose the fault lines." She smiled gently into the fire. The listener who hunted alongside me has become an active seeker of truth. You spotted the locked window, the timeline cracks, the nervous hands, the hidden glances, and the objects that whispered their secrets. That is the real satisfaction of these hunts. Not merely the solution, but the sharpened eye and the deeper understanding of our fellow creatures. Miss Marple folded her knitting and set it aside, the soft wool resting neatly in the basket. The fire burned lower now, its warmth still enveloping the room, while the scent of tea lingered pleasantly. Outside, the village of St. Mary Mead slept peacefully under the stars, much as St. Aldwyn's would soon do again. "Until the next hunt, dear listener," she said softly, her voice warm with affection. "Keep watching, keep noticing. The world is full of small mysteries, and the careful observer will always find the truth waiting to be uncovered." The clock struck the hour with a gentle chime. The fire gave one last contented crackle, and Miss Marple rose to draw the curtains against the night, ready for whatever the next day might bring.